Shalom, everyone. Shalom, everyone. Erev Tov. This is already a wonderful reunion. I'm Rabbi Yael Splansky. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Holy Blossom Temple for what promises to be a motivating and galvanizing evening. Welcome also to those who are joining us through the live stream. We're glad you're with us. When Elie Wiesel traveled to the Soviet Union in 1965, shalom, everyone. We good? Okay. We work out the kinks with me up here. It'll be perfect. It'll be perfect. When Elie Wiesel traveled to the Soviet Union in 1965, he stayed from Rosh Hashanah through Simchat Torah. And he came back with a report, and he said, "The condition of the Jews in the Soviet Union is at once more grievous and more hopeful than I had imagined." I believe the same could be said about the Jewish condition today. When we gathered this year for Rosh Hashanah, for the first anniversary of October 7th, when we gathered for Yom Kippur, for the first yahrzeit of 1,200 souls, on Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, we were, like Wiesel, travelers of sorts. And we've come out on the other side now with a similar assessment. The condition of the Jews in Israel and throughout the diaspora is at once more grievous and more hopeful than we imagined. Tonight we will salute some of Canada's leading activists in the movement to free Soviet Jewry. Tonight we will celebrate the successful global effort which led to the liberation of 2.75 million Jews from behind the Iron Curtain. Tonight we will remind one another that we are not helpless, that coordinated and consistent activism can, in fact, change the trajectory of human history. And tonight we will consider together what were the strategies then that might be applied in our own time to the effort to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. First, we will hear from Wendy Eisen. Then she will be joined by the Honorable Erwin Kotler in conversation moderated by Bonnie Goldberg. And if time allows, we'll open the floor for Q&A. It is my great honor to welcome and introduce Wendy Eisen. Many of you, I know, are family and friends and fans of Wendy, so you already know that her commitment to the Jewish people is steadfast, and that when she is determined that something must be done, she is unstoppable. Wendy learned Jewish leadership from her parents and here at Holy Blossom Temple, where she was consecrated and confirmed. Here, like her sister Carol before her, Wendy was elected to bring the floral offering to the Bima on Shavuot. That was the mark of leadership then. At the young age of 16, it was already apparent. There is hardly a local Jewish organization Wendy has not supported or spearheaded. She recently received the Order of Canada in recognition for her leadership among Canadian Jewry and for her role as an activist in the global campaign to liberate Jews from the Soviet Union. Wendy Eisen is proud to be the central link in the chain of 5 generations here at Holy Blossom Temple. And we are proud of the countless ways she has strengthened our congregation throughout the years. Please join me in applauding her leadership.
Well, good evening, dear friends. Oh, wow, this is very exciting. Before I say anything from my prepared notes, I have to tell you that a few months ago, my friend Judy Winberg came to the house, and she said, "I know you have a lot of Soviet Jewry material, and I happen to be involved with the Ontario Jewish Archives, and I'd like to come to see the material." So she came with the curator, and I had everything all laid out, and the curator would have walked out of the house with the green garbage bag filled with all these wonderful archives. And I said to Judy, I feel like I'm giving away one of my children. I can't do this. We have to have a Soviet Jewry retrospective, because it's just too important for this to go into boxes that somebody may do a term paper on in 50 years. So I called Rabbi Splansky, who immediately said yes. And where is Avi? I'm looking, oh, there she is. And we were fortunate enough to find a wonderful curator who does magic. And after we're all assembled here and we go downstairs after this program, we will see the results of Abby's work. So, good evening, dear friends. As a longtime member of Holy Blossom, allow me to add my voice of welcome to each of you tonight. And thank you, Rabbi Splansky, for your warm words, and especially for your enthusiastic response when approached to launch at Holy Blossom Temple a retrospective of Canada's involvement in the Soviet Jewry movement. And it's highly appropriate for this exhibition to be launched here. For when the plight of Soviet Jews became known in the West, it was Holy Blossom's senior rabbi, the late Rabbi Gunter Plaut, who awakened Canadian consciousness by speaking out for Jews whose voices were silenced. And in addition, Holy Blossom was the first Toronto synagogue to create a vibrant Soviet Jewry committee, setting the stage for other synagogues to follow. That better? Well, you're a pro. Our exhibition is entitled, and Rabbi Splansky named it, How the Soviet Jewry Movement Can Inspire Today's Activism. We are deeply grateful to Avi Margolis, who curated the exhibition with professional expertise, and as well, our heartfelt thanks go to Judy Winberg, a past president of Holy Blossom Temple, who produced this exciting project that has come to fruition this evening. Now, following this program, you will all be the first guests to view the exhibition. It's on display in the atrium, where we will also enjoy dessert and coffee. So now, please relax. Enjoy having your memories refreshed as we revel in the success of this remarkable moment in Jewish history. Soviet Jewry, the modern-day Exodus, is but a minuscule chapter in the history of the Jewish people. However, 50 years ago, rescuing Jews from the Soviet Union became the highest priority on the global Jewish agenda. Public pressure, nonviolent activism, and unwavering dedication pried open the Iron Curtain, producing an aliyah of historic proportions and making a dramatic impact on Israel's political, academic, and cultural landscapes. Present this evening are many men and women who played an instrumental role in this campaign. And I'm going to ask you to please stand if you attended Soviet Jewry demonstrations, made telephone calls to the Soviet Union, wrote to Soviet officials, adopted a refusenik or prisoner, had a child who twinned a bar or bat mitzvah, or if you traveled to the USSR to meet with refuseniks. Look around, everybody. You are the foot soldiers. You were the foot soldiers in this rescue movement, and we honor you. But I'd like to mention a few individuals whose activism was exemplary. Shirley Hannick is here, and I don't think Marcia is, but would you stand up, Shirley? Shirley and Marcia created and chaired Holy Blossom Soviet Jewry Committee. Right here, there were 12 refusenik families. 12 refusenik families were adopted by Holy Blossom Temple over a period of 10 years, and countless bar and bat mitzvah students twinned their bar and bat mitzvahs with their counterparts in the Soviet Union. Jeanette Goldman, please stand. Jeanette was one of 3 Russian-speaking activists in the world who made daily telephone calls to the Soviet Union. Joyce Eklov, who's sitting beside her, led the bar and bat mitzvah twinning campaign in day schools and synagogues, first in Montreal, and then she just brought her hat with her when she came to Toronto. Sharon Wolf. Sharon and I traveled together to the USSR in December 1978. We were actually the first Canadian activists. They didn't know that we had an advocacy movement in Canada. So we had a huge responsibility and lots of wonderful memories. But when Sharon returned, she assumed the role of briefing and debriefing travelers. When she and I went, we had to be briefed and debriefed in New York, but she became the briefer here, and her work was absolutely invaluable. And is Sheldon Diesenhaus here? Oh, there he is. Sheldon and his traveling partner, Rick Orsi, who has gone on Aliyah, good news, they became the briefers for the Toronto travelers. And my friend Selma Edelstone. She symbolically, stand up, Selma. She adopted prisoner Yuli Edelstein as her cousin. And that's another story you'll hear about later. And Stan and Debbie Solomon. Stan and Debbie were really Anatoly Sharansky's blood relatives, are really. And along with the late Gloria and Herb Landis, they advocated endlessly for his release. So let us all applaud their efforts. Many of us present this evening can trace our ancestry back a few generations to Russia in the early 1900s. During the British brutal Tsarist regime, raging pogroms massacred 100,000 Jews, causing a torrent of terrified Jews to flee the country. 200,000 emigrated to Great Britain, and 60,000 to Palestine. Among the 2 million Russian Jews who chose North America were many of our grandparents who established roots in Canada. The Tsarist monarchy was toppled by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and replaced in 1922 by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR or the Soviet Union. Its communist doctrine of atheism outlawed religion. Synagogues and Jewish schools were closed. Hebrew and Yiddish publications were banned, and emigration ground to a halt, leaving 3 million Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain. In November 1947, the USSR was among the 33 countries that voted at the United Nations in favor of a Jewish state in Palestine. And when Israeli statehood was declared on May the 14th, 1948, Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, appointed Golda Meir as the Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union. That Rosh Hashanah, when the Israeli delegation arrived at the Moscow synagogue, they were greeted on the street by 50,000 Jews calling out, "Nasha Golda," our Golda. These brave men and women had come to express their identification with their historic homeland. Soon after, the ruthless Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, reversed his position on the Jews and ordered the murder of Yiddish theater director Solomon Mikhoels, followed by the execution of 26 Jewish writers and poets. As life for Soviet Jews became intolerable, Israel's foreign ministry began sending emissaries to the USSR to maintain contact with the Jews. And as Rabbi Splansky said, the 1965 visit by the prominent Holocaust survivor and author Elie Wiesel prompted him to write The Jews of Silence. "I went to Russia," wrote Wiesel, "drawn by the silence of its Jews, and I brought back their cry. What torments me most is the silence of the Jews I live among today." In 1967, Israel's victory in the Six-Day War emboldened a handful of courageous Jews to be silent no more, and they applied to emigrate to Israel. Some received exit visas. Most were refused. They became the refuseniks. Refuseniks were dismissed from their jobs. Their apartments were searched, and Jewish books and Hebrew texts confiscated. Some were arrested on spurious charges, tried and imprisoned. In June of 1970, 16 desperate refuseniks plotted to seize an airplane in Leningrad and fly to freedom. Arrested on the tarmac, they were accused of treason and sentenced to prison terms between 8 to 15 years. 2 received the death penalty. The Leningrad trial sentences provoked global outcry. In Canada, protests were held outside Ottawa's Parliament buildings, at Montreal's Soviet consulate, and Rabbi Plout led the protest in Toronto's Nathan Phillips Square. Days later, the 2 death sentences were commuted to 15 years imprisonment, and the other sentences were reduced. It became clear. The global cry for clemency for the Leningrad trial prisoners had been heard behind the Iron Curtain. In the fall of 1971, Soviet Premier Kosygin visited Canada as a guest of the Canadian government. Rabbi Plout led a march of 60 Canadian rabbis, all wearing talit and carrying prayer books, to Ottawa's Soviet embassy. Standing outside the iron fence, Rabbi Plout began. "Mr. Kosygin, we accuse the Soviet government of persecuting Jews, of stamping out their identity, of fostering anti-Semitism. We demand that you give Jews their cultural identity, give them their language, give them synagogues that function, give them schools, give them access to their cultural treasures, and grant exit visas to the thousands of Jews who have applied for emigration to Israel." Jewish protesters dogged every hour of the Soviet premier's cross-Canada tour. The Kremlin received the message. Kol Yisrael Aravim Zolazeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. I was born when trains were barreling to Auschwitz, when Western silence condemned 6 million Jews to unspeakable deaths. We dared not be silent again. The case for Soviet Jewry was our second chance. In 1974, I was invited to hear an Israeli diplomat in Montreal speak about Soviet Jewry. His words struck a deep chord when he said, and I quote, "Activists create a living bridge, carrying the voices of Soviet Jews to the free world." Overnight, I became an activist. And along with a few other young mums, we formed the Montreal 35s. We were modeled after the British 35s, so named when 35 women around the age of 35 protested in London against the imprisonment of a 35-year-old Jewish librarian from Odessa. After her release, it was a reporter who dubbed the women the 35s. Like our British counterparts, we dressed in black and took to the streets with the ancient Passover cry, Shalach et Ami, let my people go. We wrote press releases, painted signs, and barraged the Soviet authorities with letters and petitions on behalf of individual refuseniks and prisoners. We soon became a sisterhood of 35s groups in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Winnipeg, all vowing to stay the course until every Soviet Jew who wished to emigrate to Israel was free to do so. The Soviets acted, we reacted. When a group of Moscow refuseniks demanded explanations for their refusals, they were herded onto buses, taken to a forest, and brutally beaten. The next day, the 35 stood outside Montreal's Soviet consulate, wrapped in bloodied bandages, holding signs reading, "Visas, not beatings." The Moscow Circus came to Winnipeg, and the 35s, chained together, marched through downtown streets. In June of 1974, the Bolshoi Ballet came to perform in Canada. Our creative demonstrations received greater press coverage than the performances. Leaving someone dressed as a prisoner in a block of 40 empty seats in Montreal's Place des Arts became newsworthy. And the next night, when patrons approached Toronto's O'Keefe Centre, they viewed 50 women in striped prison garb, chained at their shoulders, carrying signs that read, "I bet they aren't dancing in the Gulag." When the Berioska dance troupe performed in Montreal later that year, the 35s distributed a two-sided program to patrons. One side described the cast, the other side, the outcasts. Our success was realized when a notice appeared in the Globe and Mail stating, quote, "The Kirov Ballet has canceled its 1975 Canadian tour due to public protests." Freeing Soviet Jews became a human rights issue, attracting members of all faiths. Soviet Jewry committees were formed by lawyers and jurists, academics, scientists, and interfaith clergy. Doctors formed a cancer patients committee, and the Committee to Free Anatoly Sharansky was founded by Sharansky's Canadian family. Our Canadian Parliamentary Group for Soviet Jewry was the largest nonpartisan parliamentary group in the world. It was comprised of 283 members of parliament. And in May of 1984, in the presence of 200 members of all three parties, parliamentary hearings were held in Ottawa addressing the plight of refuseniks, and they demanded immediate action regarding immigration rights. Communication with the West became the lifeline for Soviet Jews. Telephone contact with refuseniks was critical to receiving current information. 2 of the 3 Russian-speaking activists making daily calls to the USSR lived in Toronto, the late Zhenya Intredar and Jeanette Goldman, who is present this evening. Travel to the USSR became a meaningful way to establish contact with the refuseniks and with families of the prisoners. Travelers carried with them Hebrew textbooks and Jewish educational material, along with clothing and high-tech items for sale on the black market to provide income for refuseniks who had been dismissed from their jobs. The eyes of the free world focused on Anatoly Sharansky, a prominent spokesman for the Moscow refusenik community. After being followed endlessly by the KGB. On March 15, 1977, he was arrested while in the company of foreign journalists and held for 16 months without charges. Finally, in July 1978, Sharansky was charged with espionage and treason, brought to trial, and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 10 years hard labor. This prompted a global advocacy campaign led by his wife Avital, who had emigrated to Israel the day after their wedding. His case was immediately championed by Canadian lawyer Irwin Cotler, and we're so happy to have Irwin with us today. This was before he was the Honorable Irwin Cotler, but in my mind, he was always the Honorable Irwin Cotler. His 800-page legal brief proving Sharansky's innocence was delivered a few months later to the Soviet Procurator General. On February the 11th, 1986, after serving 3,255 days in the Soviet Gulag, 430 of which were spent in isolation in punishment cells, Natan Sharansky was released. Satellite television allowed millions to witness his first steps into freedom as he crossed Berlin's snowy Glienicke Bridge from east to west Germany, wearing oversized trousers, a long coat, a fur hat, and a broad smile. Meeting Avital after a 12-year separation, he looked at his wife with a sheepish grin and said, "Sorry, I'm late." They were met in Israel by an ecstatic, tumultuous crowd, including the Prime Minister, and he immediately adopted his Hebrew name, Natan. Natan Sharansky's release was a huge victory. However, emigration figures had fallen to an all-time low, forcing activists to embrace innovative ideas. An opportunity arose when Toronto's Selma Edelstone and her late husband Gordon learned that Jewry Edelstein, a prominent Moscow Hebrew teacher, had been arrested and sentenced to exile in a forced labor camp. I'll never forget that night, Selma. After telephoning every Edelstein, Edelstone, and Edelson in the Toronto phone book, 15 strangers met at Selma's home, and Edelsteins for Edelstein was born. That night, Jewry Edelstein's adopted Toronto family pledged to press the Soviets for their cousin's freedom. And at the next meeting, I think they raised enough money and bought him a down parka because it was the middle of the winter in Siberia. At a subsequent family meeting, a CBC crew reported on the Edelstein connection, and in May 1987, the crew returned again, this time for a party celebrating Jewry's release and arrival in Israel. Now, several months later, Jewry Edelstein visited Toronto, and he was welcomed to the Edelstein home by his large adopted family. "So many relatives all at once," he joked. "Without you, I wouldn't have had a chance." Now, our Jewry Edelstein was a star. During more than 20 years as a member of the Knesset, he served as Speaker of the Knesset from 2013 to 2020. And then, 1985, dramatic changes occurred when Mikhail Gorbachev, a politician and statesman, became the last leader of the Soviet Union. He introduced glasnost and perestroika, which meant openness and restructuring, and that led the country towards social democracy. Among Gorbachev's many reforms was the opening of emigration. At last, the dream of Soviet Jews became fulfilled. Emigration to Israel, which had been reduced to a mere trickle, became an aliyah of historic proportions. And on December 26th, 1991, the red flag bearing the hammer and sickle was lowered for the last time. And as the Iron Curtain parted, Soviet Jews began their 2,000-year journey home, bursting onto the brilliant landscape of their historic homeland.
Each one of those sentences is a whole chapter, really. I came of age during the last lap of the movement for Soviet Jewry. I was 16 and the social action vice president of my local synagogue youth group. I organized a busload of teenagers from my west of Boston town, and on December 6th, 1987, we drove forever through a blizzard to reach Washington, D.C., where more than 200,000 people rallied on that Freedom Sunday. But people like Wendy Eisen and Erwin Kotler had already been very serious about this work, even taking personal risks for many years. They brought their smarts, their commitment, their creativity. Often enough, they had to also bring their courage and self-sacrifice. This wasn't for them a hobby or a trend. It was a calling, and they changed history. It is my pleasure now to invite the Honorable Erwin Kotler to join Wendy Eisen. We welcome him back to Holy Blossom Temple. He is, of course, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. He is the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He is an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, longtime member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer and scholar. Among the many awards which recognize his contributions to this country, Erwin Kotler received the Order of Canada and also Holy Blossom Temple's Rabbi W. Gunter Plaut Humanitarian Award. In 2022, he was profiled in the documentary film First to Stand: The Cases and Causes of Erwin Kotler. In 2023, he was awarded Israel's Presidential Medal of Honor by Israeli President Isaac Herzog. He is a national treasure, and he is a treasure of Am Yisrael. And Bonnie Goldberg will be moderating the conversation. She's a longtime member of Holy Blossom Temple. She chairs our ethics committee. She is a lawyer who serves as the presiding officer at the Inquest's Office of Ontario's Chief Coroner. And she currently serves in a volunteer capacity, which is really another full-time second job, as the vice chair of the newly established ALCCA, the Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism. And we could draw a direct line. What set Bonnie on this path many years ago was when she was Wendy Eisen's research assistant while Wendy was writing her book, Count Us In. Please join me in welcoming Bonnie too.
Before we sit down to the panel, I just want to say how honored I feel to share this with my dear friend Erwin. I first met Erwin Kotler when we were both students at McGill University. I was invited to hear him debate, and the debate was, I'd rather be red than dead, and then he turned to the other side, and it was, I'd rather be dead than red. I didn't know anything about the Soviet Union at that point. I was just impressed with the brilliance of this man. Little did I know he'd be spending the rest of his life trying to prove it. But as young adults, we shared the passion of the Soviet Jewry movement, so it's wonderful, Erwin, to have you here. And I'm especially thrilled that Bonnie is moderating our discussion, because when, as the rabbi said, when she was a university student, she was invaluable as my research assistant. And we conducted 125 interviews with activists across Canada, including some in Israel. I must say that I didn't listen to one of the interviews. Bonnie listened to them all. She skillfully transcribed the interviews and summarized the voluminous material. And here we are 30 years later. I can hardly believe it. Bonnie's now a practicing lawyer, very accomplished in her own right. And I want to thank you, honey, for being the moderator in this panel discussion.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. We're all on? Okay, great. Okay, I want to highlight some of the themes that Wendy has spoken to us about and that you'll see in the exhibit downstairs, and pull out some of the pieces that I think are very relevant to today's activists who are facing their own challenges on a global scale. And I'm going to start with the Honorable Erwin Kotler. We have heard others say, and I have heard others say, that the last time we saw true Jewish unity was during the global campaign to liberate Soviet Jewry, when Jews from all political backgrounds came together for a common cause. What do you think was the secret to rallying in that type of unity for this movement?
I think the secret was solidarity in a just cause. We may not remember that we not only had the struggle of world Jewry for Soviet Jews, but the struggle for Soviet Jewry was one of the great human rights struggles of the second half of the 20th century, along with the struggle against apartheid. And so the struggle mobilized not only Jews, but it mobilized governments, parliaments, civil society, and amongst civil society, those who led that movement were, as Sharansky put it, housewives and students. The women, the 35s, were an international women's rights movement. And here I want to commend Wendy. She not only was a founder and leader of the 35s in Canada, she not only was a leader amongst the foot soldiers, so many of whom are represented here this evening. It warmed my heart, when you asked people stand up, the foot soldiers, because it was the women who are at the forefront of that struggle. And I want to say about Wendy, because this cannot be said about anybody else, she became the chronicler of the struggle for Soviet Jewry. And we saw that this evening in her remarks, and wrote the only book with regard to the struggle for Soviet Jewry here in Canada, with the right title, Count Us In. And so that's what leadership is all about. As I said, solidarity in a just cause. And if I may, when Rabbi Splatsky mentioned, Elie Wiesel, I just was reading, just the other day, it was printed again in the foreword, Elie Wiesel's recall of his visit to the Soviet Union then in 1965. I mean, it's very moving. But then he says, it had a transformative impact on my life, on who I am. And that's what this struggle was all about. It had a transformative impact on all our lives.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you. And as you've pointed out and we've heard, the movement enjoyed unprecedented international support that I think today's activists might find astounding and confounding. Wendy, I'd love to hear from you about your recollections of something called the Second World Conference on Soviet Jewry that occurred in Brussels in 1976.
The 35s were formed in 1974, and for 2 years we were basically, we could say, operating in a Canadian vacuum. And it wasn't until the International Conference for Soviet Jewry in Brussels in '76 that we really felt like we were part of an international movement. And it took place in February 1976 in a large Congress hall. There were 1,200 members, delegates to the Second World Conference on Soviet Jewry, 70 representatives from Canada. And of those representatives, there were 3 members of Parliament, Bob Kaplan, Serge Joyal, and who was the third? Can't remember. And there were 4 members of the 35s, and the rest were Canadians who were very involved in the movement. As a cute aside, and I think that you'll all appreciate this, we were young moms and we were really kind of excited about going to Brussels for 3 days. So we went shopping and bought lovely clothes. And at the last minute, I remember saying, maybe we should throw a pair of black pants and a black top in, because the 35s always wore black, because we're going to be meeting our international counterparts. Well, P.S., we were a total of 30 women from the 35s, most of them from Great Britain. We put our black pants and our black top on day 1, and we didn't take it off for 3 days. And it was interesting because Golda Meir talked about the women dressed in black. That was really quite amazing. Do you have the book? But what I think was the most, Erwin, you were there, so you can remember too. And I couldn't possibly say it as well as it was written here, so let me just find it. On opening night, the delegates were seated in the Palais de Congrès under signposts of their respective countries. That was 32 countries, when a hush enveloped the massive hall. A group of former Soviet Jews, some of whom had arrived from the Soviet Union only days before, entered the room. 1,200 men and women stood at their seats and welcomed them with thunderous applause. As the delegates remained standing for the singing of Hatikva, a man ran down the center aisle to the dais, trailing a royal blue flag with a white Star of David in the center. The Soviet Jewry Freedom Flag, designed in Refusnik Mark Asbel's Moscow apartment a few weeks earlier, was raised for the first time. Brussels, too, was declared officially open. That was quite a moment.
Brussels was not just a conference, it was the launch of an international movement. And that's what distinguished the struggle for Soviet Jewry. It was a global movement, and it became a global human rights movement. And that was the power of solidarity and a just cause. You mentioned Gorbachev was mentioned earlier. It's a very interesting story that he once shared with me that I might just share. And I happened to have been on a panel with Gorbachev in 1987, and it was not long after Sharansky had been released. A year earlier, it's been mentioned. And I always wondered, what role did Gorbachev have in his release, because it was shortly after he himself became the head of the Soviet Union. So I asked him, and then through a translator, he told me something which was very revealing. He said, I made my first visit outside the Soviet Union to Canada, and I went there as a Secretary of Agriculture. He said, and when I was in Canada, I appeared before the Committee of Agriculture of the Canadian Parliament. He said, they asked me a few questions about agriculture. Then they started to ask about this, Sharansky. I didn't know what they were talking about. He said, then I left the Parliament buildings, and there was this huge demonstration on behalf of this Sharansky. He said, then I spent the weekend as a guest of your minister, Eugene Whalen. He said, and yes, we talked about agriculture, kept bringing up the question of Sharansky. And so when I came back to the Soviet Union, I became the head of the Soviet Union, I ordered up his file. He said, yes, he said, yes, he was a troublemaker. He said, but it was costing us to keep him in prison. It was costing us politically. It was costing us diplomatically. It was costing us economically. So I ordered his release in our self-interest. And that's when I learned that the key thing about advocacy, mobilize in such a way that they realize that it's in their self-interest, along with the justice of the cause, to release the political prisoner. So it was the solidarity of the movement here that made Gorbachev realize it was in his self-interest to bring about Sharansky's release.
That's a great story. I think another thing that was vitally important about the international conference were the meetings that took place, not at the plenary sessions, but the meetings that took place in the halls between the activists and the planning that we were doing. And it was certainly a great confidence builder for the 35s. But I would just like to tell you that on the last day, Golda Meir was the chair. She presided over the conference. And she seemed to me pretty old at that time. She was 70. I mean, I really thought of her as pretty old at that time. But so I just have to tell you what she said when the conference ended. The 70-year-old grandmother began her concluding speech by asking a rhetorical question. What is it that anti-Semites can't forgive us? What is the greatest of our faults? We refuse to disappear. No matter how strong, brutal, or ruthless the powers against us might be, here we are. Millions of bodies have been broken, buried alive, and burned to death, but never was anyone able to break the spirit of the Jewish people. Golda Meir concluded her address in a thunderous voice. If the Russians will not let our brethren be Jews in Russia, then let them come to their historic homeland. I guarantee you, Russia's rulers of Moscow, the Jews of the Soviet Union will be free. That was how she ended. That's how the conference ended.
Very true words that have a lot of impact for today's generation. We're going to hear, I think, from Natan Sharansky directly, but before we do, might I ask Erwin how he became involved in that legal case?
Well, here the 35s again played a distinguishable role here. Avital Sharansky, who left the Soviet Union in 1974, a day after they were married, they assured her that he would be allowed to follow, but then, of course, he ended up in prison. And then in 1977, Avital was looking for a lawyer for Anatoly. He couldn't get a lawyer in the Soviet Union other than one who would want to keep him in prison. And he spoke to the 35s, the Canadian 35s, and she asked them, who do you suggest could be? So they suggested me, and that's how I ended up being Sharansky's lawyer. Again, the connection with the 35s brought that about. But I have to say I was following Sharansky's case from 1974, you know, when he was then initially a refusenik. What struck me about Anatoly, is then known, but Natan Sharansky, is he wasn't only a leader of the refusenik movement. He was also a leader of 4 other human rights movements in the Soviet Union. He was unique in that regard. He was a leader of the democracy movement, together with Andrei Sakharov. He was a leader of the and founder of the Helsinki Rights Group in the Soviet Union at the time. He was a leader of the ethnic and religious rights movement. I remember meeting Ukrainians and Pentecostals, and they would say to me, you know, Sharansky is as important to us as he would be to you, because he went down the line, and he was a leader in the movement to free other political prisoners in the Soviet Union until he himself became a political prisoner. So he was the quintessential human rights advocate, though the struggle for Soviet Jewry was at the forefront of his advocacy, and also because he also saw that too as being a human rights cause. So I think that how I got involved in his case and cause. And then in 1978, after you mentioned when he was initially charged with those two crimes of treason and anti-Soviet slander and agitation, then I worked on a legal brief on his behalf. Avital came over, and I'll never forget, we went to visit Trudeau, and this was in the fall of '78, and we presented him with a copy of the legal brief, and I asked him would he convey it officially to the Soviet authorities, have it served on them as an official legal document coming from the Canadian government. And I still remember, you know, Pierre Trudeau's words. He looked at Avital, and by the way, I think the only reason we got the meeting with Pierre Trudeau was because of Avital's compellability in all respects, and she became, while Natan was in prison, she became the voice, the identity, the inspiration for the Soviet Jewry movement. And nobody, no world leader would ever be able to refuse her request for a meeting. And when we were together with the Prime Minister, I gave him a copy of the brief, and he said to me, I still remember those words, he said, okay, Kotler, I'll take it home and I'll read it over the weekend. He said, that was him. If it's good, he said, you'll have my support Monday morning. If it's lousy, I'll kick your ass in for wasting my weekend. Anyhow, on Monday, he got in touch and said, I think more because of Avital and myself, that he would make sure that the brief was delivered officially to the Soviet Union. It was a brief that I got a power of attorney not only from Avital, but from Natan's mother at the time. And that's how I became involved in his case and cause. And the legal brief, I was told, then became an underground bestseller in the Soviet Union.
That's amazing. Thank you.
I have to add something to that, Erwin, because during the 5 days of Sharansky's trial, fortunately it was the middle of July, and it was warm. And the 35s had, they 24/7. It was 24/5. We were outside the Soviet consulate for 5 days straight at midnight. Fortunately, the consulate in Montreal was on a steep, dead-end street. So we hauled sleeping bags out at midnight, and we slept on the street for 5 days until the verdict was announced. And then, of course, you couldn't talk to Erwin because for the next 6 weeks he was writing this brief. I remember calling to ask you a question, you wouldn't talk to me. In any case, so this was July of 1978. Sharon and I went to the Soviet Union in December of '78. And we were the very first Canadian activists who were going to meet with refuseniks. And the day before we left, Erwin called me and he said, I want to talk to you. I want to come to your house before you leave tomorrow. I said, sure, what time are you coming? He said, 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. Is that a surprise, Ariella? 12 o'clock, Erwin arrived, and he said, you have to do one thing for me. You have to bring back a letter from Ida Milgram, who was Sharansky's mother, giving me the authority to act, to be the power of attorney for Natan Sharansky. So I went with that one goal. Sharon, I'm sure you remember how nervous we were, making sure. So the very first day that we were invited to one of the refuseniks' homes in Moscow, there was a scientific seminar going on. And as we got there, the leader of the women's movement brought Sharon and me to the house. And as we were getting there, all these scientists were leaving. And somebody said, just a second, go back. These are some Canadians who want to talk to you. So they all went back into Victor Brailovsky's living room. There were 40 chairs. I looked at these 40 people. I thought, I held his face on a sign in a demonstration last week in Montreal. All these brilliant people who were physicists, scientists, they had degrees up to here. What was I going to say to them? Anyway, I had to plead the case of Erwin Kotler to tell them that this just wasn't a fly-by-night lawyer. This was a man who was highly regarded in our country, and the brief that had been delivered to the Procurator General was something serious, and that what I needed more than anything else, we had to leave with a letter from Sharansky's mother giving him the authority to act on his behalf. As luck would have it, one of the people in the audience was Sharansky's brother, Leonid. So he came, he said, well, how long are you going to be here? We told him when our last night was, and he said, I'll get the letter from my mother, and she lived in Yehupitzville. In any case, the last night that we were there, Leonid came. We were meeting in another refusenik's apartment. At this point, Sharon and I were pretty famous with the refuseniks at this point. She would sit with some of them and take down notes. I would sit with others, and at night we would be in our bedroom, and we couldn't talk to each other because we knew that there were bugs. So we would write on the magic slate. Remember the magic slate? We would transcribe all our notes in secret into our diaries. Then we would burn the notes and flush them down the toilet. I mean, anyway, the very last night, Leonid Sharansky came, and he said, here's the letter from my mother. Of course, it was all in Russian. So I looked at him, and I said, Leonid, we have been followed for 10 days since we've been here. What if this letter is confiscated? So he wrote in my daily diary. Remember the diaries we used to have before we had phones? So this was the diary that I had. Oops. And written on this page is, I hereby authorize Professor Erwin Kotler of Montreal, Canada, to act on behalf of my brother Anatoly Sharansky, signed Leonid Sharansky. Well, the letter got out. You said that you have it.
Yes, yeah.
You know where it is?
Yeah, we have it. Yeah.
Something for the archives.
In any case, the letter got out, Sharansky got out, and Erwin and Natan are very good friends to this day.
You can see that Wendy was not only a good, an exemplary chronicler, but also a great lawyer in her own way on our behalf. There's a funny anecdote with regard to Sharansky. I was in Syria in that summer of '78, and I found out in Syria that Sharansky was being tried in the Soviet Union. So I had to get back to Canada. And I got out of Syria, I won't go into that story. And then I come to Jordan, and it's one of the craziest things. I was supposed to be in Jordan for about 2 weeks, but I couldn't, so I told them I had to leave. Now, it was hard to get in, it was also hard to get out. So finally I got out, and then I come to the border, the Allenby Bridge, and there's an Israeli on the other side. Ariella knows the story. It's a very funny story. And I tell the Israeli that I have to come into Israel because he says, who are you? I looked disheveled even more than usual. And I said to him, what could I say? I said, I happen to be Sharansky's lawyer. And he looks at me, you are Sharansky's lawyer? So, I think he thought, he said, where are you coming from? I said, Syria and Jordan. And he says, and you're Sharansky's lawyer. So I said, he wouldn't believe. So I said, I'll tell you what. I said, do you know Ariella from the Knesset? Ariella's then working with, I said, Ariella, he said, oh, Ariella mi Likud. I said, yeah, call her. So he calls, and I understood Hebrew, and he says to Ariella on the phone, he says, in Hebrew to her, but I understood, he says, Ariella, yesh po meshugad, there's a crazy guy here. And he says that he's Sharansky's lawyer. So then she told him, Ken, she agrees with him, Ken hu meshugad, yeah. And she says, but he also happens to be Sharansky's lawyer. So then he turns to me, he says, okay, so you are Sharansky's lawyer, but Ariella agreed with me that you are crazy. And that's how I got into Israel and then came back to Canada.
I have one last question before we go to the next part of the program. And I would like each of you to leave us with one lesson from the Soviet Jewry, the movement to liberate Soviet Jews, that you think would resonate with today's generation of activists.
I think I began by saying, it's the power of solidarity in a just cause. Not only the belief in the justice of the cause, but acting on that belief. And what we did is we created a critical mass of advocacy on behalf of that just cause, as Wendy mentioned. Today they talk a lot about intersectionality. The Soviet Jewry movement patented intersectionality in the best sense of the word. We had women for Soviet Jewry, students for Soviet Jewry, parliamentarians for Soviet Jewry, scientists for Soviet Jewry, doctors for Soviet Jewry, interfaith for Soviet Jewry. In other words, a critical mass of advocacy on behalf of a just cause. It was that critical mass of advocacy that moved governments, that moved parliaments, that moved civil society, and made the Soviet Jewry movement a great historical struggle and movement for the world in the second half of the 20th century.
Thank you.
Couldn't say it much better than that. But I must say that it's the allies that we need. And this is what I think is quite important about the organization that Mark Sandler has founded, which is called the Alliance of Canadians
Combating
Anti-Semitism, ALCCA. And he has reached out, and we're continuing to reach out to non-Jewish allies. And this is the answer, because for Jews fighting to get Jews out of the Soviet Union would be normal, but for non-Jews, fighting is not normal, and that's how we had our strength. And this is what we must do for anti-Semitism. We've got to get our allies. It's not enough for Jews, and I think an interfaith committee is the way to be going.
Thank you.
We're on our way.
Bonnie, I want to commend you and Mark. I think he's one of the best lawyers I've ever met. And I think you and him working together in common cause, this group is superb, and kol hakavod for your initiative.
And ALCCA have 40 organizations, among them Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, and Hindu. Anyway, it's quite terrific. And Bonnie, good for you.
Thank you.
Oh, the video. Yes, Richard. We have a video, don't we, with Sharansky.
Do you want to tell us what we're about to hear?
Well, this is an interview. This is an interview with Natan Sharansky, who is in Jerusalem right now. So I think the video will speak for itself.
In Stalin, Donetsk, which today is the center of the war between Russia and Ukraine, but then it was one Soviet empire. And I was one of millions of absolutely assimilated Soviet Jews. So the education which I got was, you should not be ashamed that you're a Jew, but because you're a Jew, it's kind of disease. You have to learn how to live with this, and to live with this to be the best in physics and mathematics and chess. That is the way how we Jews survive. And I lived without identity and also without freedom. I learned from the very early childhood that you should say only what is permitted. You should read the books which are permitted. And the truth is only for the family, for the very small, close circle. The event which really changed my life was Six-Day War. But suddenly, you see how all people around you, Jews and non-Jews, those who love you and those who hate you, they're all saying how you Jews did it. And then you start reading about our history, about yourself, from the books which are brought by foreign tourists. And then there is such unbelievably interesting, exciting story, and you can be part of it. That's how you discover that you have identity. Suddenly there is meaning in your life. So then you're not afraid. You're not afraid to start speaking, to fight for your rights, then for the rights of other Jews, and then simply for freedom, the rights of everybody. KGB warned me many times for years that sooner or later, if I will not stop my activity, if I will not stop making connections between activists and the world Jewry, I'll be put in prison. And then that's what they did and accused me in high treason. And I had to remind myself, in my mind, all this list of 200 my so-called criminal accomplices, there is no way that KGB will force them to stop fighting. So this, the fact that I was so confident, absolutely sure, that this struggle doesn't stop even for a moment, that was giving me strength and hope. When Gorbachev came to power, and he was desperately looking to improve relations with the United States of America, President Reagan told him, and he said, there is no way that we will improve relations without your changing policy to Soviet Jews, and start from Natan Sharansky. So a few weeks after this, I was taken from punishing cell, where I spent a lot of hundreds of days, changed all my clothes, put in the airplane, brought me to Berlin. There I crossed the bridge from Eastern Germany to Western Germany. American ambassador took me to the small Israeli airplane, and there my wife and the team from Israel waited for me. And that was only the beginning. That was the day when I moved from hell to paradise. But the struggle continued, and when Gorbachev first came to Washington, already 250,000 Jews waited for him there, and I spent months organizing this demonstration. Our friends from Toronto and from Montreal and of course from all over America were there. And Reagan again said to Gorbachev, you see this demonstration. You understand that that's how my people think. And 1 year after this, one after another, all the prisoners of Zion were released. Then all refuseniks, one after another, were released. And in 2 years from there, Iron Curtain fell down and 1 million Jews left. It happened because exactly as a group of Soviet Jews discovered their identity and started their struggle, there were hundreds of thousands, not millions of Jews in the free world who rediscovered their identity and their duty. And you know, later I had the opportunity to say thousands of times, thank you to the army of students and housewives who defeated KGB.
It was very important to Wendy that tonight not only be a retelling of what was, as incredible as what was, she said we can't end there. We have to talk about today and how do we connect the dots from then to now. And so it was her brilliant idea that we should have today's activists with us. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Malka Daniels. Malka was the president of the TMU Hillel, and in that role she became an activist, which led her to be a law student at TMU Law now. Her writings appear in the Globe and Mail. She was interviewed by Stephen Paikin, and she represents a new generation of Canadian Jewish activists. She has joined us tonight to share just a bit of insight into today's Canadian movement to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Thank you, Malka.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Slansky, for that warm introduction, and thank you for all having me here tonight. It's a true honor to be able to stand before such dedicated leaders, activists, professionals, and community members. I'm honored to be able to learn from notable individuals in and out of the world of Jewish advocacy, and to be able to draw on the lessons shared by Ms. Eisen and how it has motivated today's activist movement, while simultaneously being able to honor my own familial history from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Jewry movement stands as a powerful example of Jewish unity that crossed the boundaries of religious denomination and geographic borders, along with the communal strength through a collective purpose. Just last year, I was finishing my undergraduate studies at Toronto Metropolitan University with plans to enter the legal field. Through that goal, I valued justice and the rights of all people in Canada, and I was actively involved in Jewish life on campus, serving as Hillel's president and Holocaust education director. I wasn't discouraged by misconceptions from people who didn't know many Jews. I saw it as part of my role to represent our community. Together with other Jewish students, we organized multi-faith events, supported other marginalized groups on campus, and worked with a commitment of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. People, my friends, knew me in class as the Jewish student, and they would often come to me with questions that they hadn't felt comfortable asking before, and I heavily enjoyed those conversations, especially being able to learn from them as well. Then October 7th changed everything. Suddenly, I noticed a shift on campus. Friends avoided me, professors looked at me with pity, and I found myself stepping back, removing my Hebrew stickers from my laptop, and avoiding interest-based student groups that I once led. A loud minority had taken over the conversation, and Jewish students were left out. I felt compelled to stay quiet, to avoid making things harder for our community. In the same week, I was preparing for the LSAT, a test that would shape my future, but I couldn't avoid the posts on social media. People I considered my friends were sharing misinformation that was hurtful and deeply unsettling. I was told to focus on my studies and that success would be the best revenge. But as protests continue, and with hate targeting the online presence of the Jewish student group Hillel, many Jewish friends of mine felt the need to hide their Magen Davids or their kippahs, and the strain of balancing classes with the growing tensions on campus became more difficult. In class, we felt unsafe as professors changed content to amplify anti-Israel fringe perspectives that alienated Jewish students. I tried to stay true to my beliefs in freedom of expression. Even as I saw protests, hateful posters, and walkouts, I thought that it would calm down eventually, but it only grew louder. I wouldn't have called myself an activist, but at the time, I would have called myself angry, frustrated, and exhausted. 2 weeks after October 7th, thinking surely the school administration would do something, someone stood in front of our main campus building with a sign claiming that Israel is bombing hospitals and schools, killing thousands of women and children, asking the question, how is this self-defense? In that moment, I couldn't stay silent. A friend and I made a simple sign in response that said, Hamas murdered, raped, and celebrated the death of innocent civilians. How is this resistance? Within minutes, a crowd surrounded us, 80 voices shouting at 5 Jewish students, calling us names and telling us to go back to where we came from, as if our right to be here was so easily dismissed. We stood in silence, letting one sign and quiet presence speak for us. The fact that those who felt free to hold their own sign would be so outraged by ours says everything about the double standard facing Jews today. Weeks later, a swastika was erected onto campus, and the identity of Jewish students were spread and doxxed. We were forced to become activists overnight because no one else would stand up for us. The Soviet Jewry movement empowered this generation of Jews. reminding us of the struggles of our past, the vision of our predecessors, and the responsibility to uphold the freedoms that they achieved. Now, as a law student, I find myself at an institution whose reputation was affected by students who tried to target Jewish self-determination and defended violence against innocent lives in Israel. Yet, I have the privilege of being able to study. And through that, I had the ability to create a new narrative, one that isn't confined by hostility, but that uses our rights in meaningful ways, rights that we all depend on. Today, the phrase "count us in" resonates strongly with young activists as we beg for a seat at the table to define our own terms and practice our own beliefs. Counting us in elicits holding institutions of higher learning accountable for the safety and respect of Jewish students while promoting safe spaces for peaceful dialogue. At the beginning of this school year, at a Welcome Back student group tabling event, a protest erupted conveniently placed right in front of our Hillel table with signs that stated, "Zionism off our campus." Security approached the students at the table asking if they would like to move, and they responded that we're not going anywhere. After that, various community members approached the table saying, "Hi, how are you?" to various Jewish students based on the fact that they saw how uncomfortable this protest has become and knew that just going up to this table and showing face was in its way a subtle show of solidarity. We see the similarities today in the coexistence of Jews of various denominations. Around the world, we're connected by the Zionist cause, and we draw on the lessons learned from this movement that taught us resilience and the impact of standing together. That legacy allows us to be here today, unwilling to let our community be minimized. To the trailblazers who came before us, we honor you. Because of that courage and determination, we will continue to uphold those freedoms. I'm fortunate for the opportunity to be here today and to shed light on how this generation is not backing down. It's clear that we never have, and I can assure you, we never will. Thank you, and I'm Yisrael Katz.
To that we say, Ken Yerbu, may the likes of you be increased. Thank you, Malka. And now for something very special, I'd like to call up our temple president, Holy Blossom Temple President Phyllis Denneberg, for something very special.
Good evening, everyone. I feel like they're tough acts to follow. Whatever I've written here, I have to stop and take a breath. I'm here as president of Holy Blossom to present the Holy Blossom Temple's President's Award to Wendy Eisen. The President's Award is awarded to recognize and honor an outstanding member or members of Holy Blossom Temple for their long-standing commitment to volunteering their time and talent in making a significant contribution to Holy Blossom. So you've heard a lot about Wendy's early years, but we wanted to highlight something she's doing very much here and still is. It's not an annual award, but it's awarded to outstanding people. As we honor Wendy Eisen with the President's Award for her outstanding work here, it's related to reestablishing the Holy Blossom Temple Foundation way back in 1997. She was busy doing a couple of other things at the same time, and she still had time for us. But let me tell you a little bit more about Wendy here at Holy Blossom. Daughter of the late Alice and Bernard Herman, whose chapel is just off our sanctuary that bears their name, attributes much of her early Jewish education to Holy Blossom and recalls happy memories of her confirmation here. We heard about her being a young mother living in Montreal and her involvement with the Soviet Jewry movement and how that brought international attention to the grassroots activism. We've heard all about that this evening, and I want to read your book. Hopefully I can find one. Thankfully for Holy Blossom, she returned to Toronto, where she grew up. And she helped to revive the Temple Foundation and continues to do work to make it succeed. In her role as one of the founders of the Reestablished Foundation in 1997, and then its president, Wendy has sustained Holy Blossom Temple. The millions of dollars that have been raised and the number of temple members engaged and inspired by the work of the foundation are irreplaceable, and they contribute in an invaluable way to the congregation that we are today. Anyone who has experienced the force of Wendy's commitment when she asks for support knows this personally. You just can't say no. Her commitment is ongoing. It seems like it's been around for a while before she brought it to Holy Blossom. Wendy doesn't ask others to do what she's not willing to do herself. Her personal philanthropy lights the way for others. As it says in Pirkei Avot, you are not required to finish the work, yet neither are you permitted to desist from it. And that really describes Wendy's tireless role model of leadership here at Holy Blossom. Let me take a moment to tell you about the President's Award. It's envisioned, or it was envisioned and implemented by my predecessor, Avra Rosen, and it's designed to be unique and meaningful to each recipient. In place of there being one award that's kept at Holy Blossom, we thought we should have a unique award in each recipient's home, something to remind them of our appreciation and gratitude for their many contributions to their second home, Holy Blossom Temple. So in this bag, I'm not going to open it, but Wendy will, I'm sure, when she gets home. We have selected a beautiful hand-blown blue glass and silver engraved Kiddush cup, designed by an Israeli artist that's both artistic and useful. We figured that would speak to Wendy. I know that Wendy and her family celebrate Shabbat and the Chagim at their dining room table, and the Kiddush cup will fit in perfectly. So Wendy, for all that you have done and continue to do, I'd like to thank you and officially present you with the Holy Blossom Temple President's Award, Mazal Tov.
Oh, I can't wait to open this. Phyllis, thank you for this treasured honor. Holy Blossom has been my lifelong spiritual home. And as Rabbi Splansky said, I was consecrated here at the age of 6 and confirmed 10 years later and married here. But we are really blessed at this temple to have exceptional spiritual leadership in Rabbi Splansky, Rabbi Kay, and Rabbi McCarroll, along with our cantorial treasures, Cantor Rosen and Lindy Rivers. So I truly accept this President's Award with deep appreciation and humility, and thank you so much.
And I feel compelled to mention that Wendy and Carol's mother's piano is here. Yeah, Alice's piano. And now a call to action from the Holy Blossom Temple Advocacy Committee, Rabbi Sam Kay.
Thank you, Rabbi Splansky. Mazel tov, Wendy. 1 year ago, Rabbi Splansky and I met to discuss what an effective and meaningful advocacy committee would look like here at Holy Blossom Temple. How could we leverage our strength? And what is our strength? Well, our strength is our diversity, it is our reach, and it is our connections. The fact that we have Jews from all over the world who call this place their home, and that they too, in turn, have friends and allies and co-workers and family in all the 4 corners of the globe who are involved in almost every single sphere imaginable. We have a unique gift here, and that unique gift is that there is only one Holy Blossom. and that our good name carries the ability to distribute the needs of the Jewish people in a way that people can trust. And over the course of this last year, a network that others trust is exactly what we have built. We regularly receive communications from partner organizations, which we then redistribute to our wide membership, to our friends, to our family, to our allies in the Jewish community, and now because of the incredible work of our advocacy committee in building bridges and interfaith alliances to like-minded Canadians across the province and beyond. Tonight, the call to action is very close at hand, though. It is right here in our backyard at U of T. Hillel Ontario has put out a wide call for help, announcing that on November 8th, U of T will host a conference entitled The Anti-Zionist Idea, History, Theory, and Politics at its St. George campus. Headlining and convening this conference are some of the most vitriolic and vicious Canadian apologists for Hamas and for Palestinian terrorism. Hillel has requested that you join your voice to theirs in objecting to the legitimacy of this conference and to let our concerns be known wide and far at the University of Toronto. Additionally, every single week, the Advocacy Committee sends out an update with action items through our congregational emails. You've heard about them tonight multiple times. I want to reiterate it again. The Alliance of Canadians Combating Anti-Semitism is doing absolutely incredible work, and they are leading right now in their motion to push back against the University of Windsor's agreement to boycott Israeli universities. And we will be highlighting their efforts, the Alliance's efforts, this week to combat that. I hope you will check our congregational email that comes out and support them. And finally, we want to make sure that everyone who is here tonight is aware that Special Envoy Deborah Lyons is coming to Holy Blossom on November 13th. And Special Envoy Lyons will address our congregation and our community at large about the important and timely next steps of how her office is combating anti-Semitism here in Canada. This is a vital conversation. It is open to the community at large. I hope to see many of you there. A brief word of Torah. In Bereshit Rabbah, the rabbis say that the sin which ended the world in the days of Noah was, of all things, petty theft. They equated it to a walk in the shuk. I saw that look, Judy. To a walk in the shuk. Imagine, if you could, Machne Yehuda Market, and there's a person who walks through it, and that person takes a nut, and then they take a candy, and then they take a slice of chalva, and then they take an olive and a little bit of bread, and they stop at every single vendor, and they just take a little bit. And it's not even enough to call it a crime until each and every person in the world does the same thing walking through the market. And then the market is empty, and then the market is ruined. It is like raindrops falling into the world, drop by drop, piece by piece. Raindrops fill the world, and so God sends the flood. But if this is the case, if little actions, kal v'chomer, if little actions can change the world, then the opposite is also true. If individual actions can destroy the world, individual actions can save it. If drops of wickedness can drown, drops of goodness can save. And Wendy, you and all those gathered here, our friends and our allies, you are proof that this is true, because your small drops overcame one of the mightiest empires of the last century. May we walk in your footsteps.
Yasher Koach to the Advocacy Committee chaired by Michael Davis. Details around what you just heard can be found downstairs. And now the final word goes to our past president of Holy Blossom Temple, Judy Winberg. She is also a former chair of Jewish Family and Child Services. I feel compelled to mention that just yesterday was the yahrzeit for her dear cousin, Joyce Feinberg, Aleha Shalom. Joyce also grew up here at Holy Blossom Temple, was educated and married here at Holy Blossom, and she was among the 11 murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. May her memory be for blessing. Judy is a representative of the Holy Blossom Temple Archives Committee, and primarily As a dear friend to Wendy Eisen, Jewry volunteered to prepare this evening with all the details in place. It really has been a labor of love for her, I know. So Jewry gets the final word tonight.
My children always tease me that I'm the closer. So here I am as the closer. That's because once I was supposed to open the ark and I missed it. But I closed it, so I am now the closer. I'm going to speak on behalf of all of you, and I haven't spoken to one of you, but I know how much you all have appreciated Wendy's presentation tonight. Wendy, Erwin Kotler, Bonnie Goldberg, where's Malka? And all the others who have contributed to tonight's efforts. Really, thank you all so, so much. I would like to ask Avi Margolis to stand. She's in the audience. Avi is our curator. Avi was recommended to me by the administration of the Ontario Jewish Archives. Avi was an intern with them a few summers ago. And I had the opportunity to see Avi's work, and I thought this woman could do an amazing job. And so Avi came to Wendy's house back in the spring, and all of Wendy's materials were laid out on the dining room table, and it's a very big dining room table. And somehow Avi was able to sift through boxes and boxes and boxes of material. She met with a number of the activists who came both to Wendy's house and here to Holy Blossom to see all of the artifacts. She was given a copy of the book, and somehow Avi was able to make some sense of this incredible work. And when you come downstairs, you'll have a chance to see the 10 panels that Avi has put together that chronicles the history that Wendy reminded us tonight. Holy Blossom is delighted to host the exhibit for the next couple of months, and we're hoping that it will have a chance to travel throughout the city and perhaps across Canada, because the lessons that we can learn from the Soviet Jewry movement can really impact the work today that is so essential. Thank you to Wendy, who, in preparing for tonight, found a few boxes of these books and has offered to make a book available, one per family to everyone. So before you leave tonight downstairs at the front desk, please have a book. Wendy signed them. You've signed 93 of them. But I have a feeling if that we need more, we might be able to find them. This concludes the evening upstairs. We invite you to come downstairs, either down the circular staircase or down the elevator. We have a delicious dessert reception. Wendy will be there to answer questions. If you enjoyed the evening, please come out again for other activities that are organized by the Adult Education Program at Holy Blossom Temple. We appreciate your support, and thank you very much.